Hello, everyone. It's Uncle Jeff, and it's a beautiful day in Oregon. So let's get started with a good story today. And this will be the story of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time, there were four little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in the sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or go down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father, rest in peace, had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. That's not good. Now, run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were the good little bunnies, went down to the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and then squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But around the end of the cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting young cabbages, but he jumped up and he ran after Peter, waving his rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and another shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have gotten away altogether if he had not, unfortunately, run into the gooseberry net protecting the gooseberry bush and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new and fashionable. Peter gave himself up for lost, shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. "Go, go, come on, Peter, get going." Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, and he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. And Peter rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a watering can, and it would have been a beautiful thing to hide in, but it had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed, "Ker-choo!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor to get through, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. And he was also very damp from sitting in that watering can. After a time, he began to wander about, going limpity-limpity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little bunny to squeeze underneath. But an old mouse was running in and out over the stone, doorstep carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth, she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Which way do I go? Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his watering can. A white cat was staring at some goldfish, and she sat very, very still. But now and then, the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, Little Benjamin Bunny. We'll get to that story another day. Peter went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes. But presently, as nothing happened, he came out. He climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over the edge. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Oh, I could see the gate in the distance there. And between the gate and Peter is the man with the hoe. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter didn't care. He slipped under the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. There's the sparrows up there cheering him on. Go, Peter, go. Mr. McGregor found the little jacket and shoes and hung them up to be a scarecrow to frighten off the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him until he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down on the nice soft sand floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he'd done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight, which is 2 weeks. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave him a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But the other kids, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. So that's the tale of Peter Rabbit. Hope you enjoyed it. Tune in again on Children's Stories by Uncle Jeff.